Hello, and welcome to this session on tools for resilience in a complex world. Very glad to have you with us. This is being sponsored by the Thunderbird School of Global Management at Arizona State University. My name is Anne Florini. I'm a faculty member at Thunderbird, where, among other things, I lead our Executive Master of Arts in Global Affairs and Management at our Washington, D.C. campus. This is a program for mid-career professionals from the public and private sectors who are looking for the tools and skills and frameworks that are needed to manage uncertainty and complexity and the great global challenges of the 21st century. And it's those skills and frameworks and tools that we're going to be talking about today. We have a packed agenda with speakers from 4 continents and a wide variety of backgrounds. In a few moments, first I will invite my co-author, Sunil Sharma, to join me in talking about reckoning with systemic hazards. Next, we'll hear from Roland Coopers, who, in addition to being a Thunderbird colleague of mine, is an internationally recognized authority on complex systems management and the new approaches to systemic risk management. Roland will be drawing on his extensive corporate experience, as well as his many path-breaking books on managing under complexity. And finally, Roland and I will have a discussion with a panel of practitioners from a wide variety of backgrounds who will be discussing how they have applied and are thinking about applying the tools and frameworks and skills that we'll be laying out today. But before I invite Sunil to join me, let me start by telling you a little bit about why Thunderbird is doing this session. This isn't your typical management education kind of approach. I think all of us are unsettled by what seem to be incessant crises and shocks. It never seems to settle back to a predictable normal. It's important to realize that despite the incessant uncertainty, we are not helpless. There are frameworks and skills and tools that can help us manage. Our session today will show you that systems thinking and resilience tools are not abstractions. They're the vital necessities for managing the conditions of the 21st century. I invite you to send us your questions throughout the session. We look forward to interacting with you. And it's now my pleasure to invite my co-author, Sunil Sharma, to join us. Welcome, Sunil.
And I'm delighted to be here.
And I am now going to share my screen and take us through a few slides. So, reckoning with systemic hazards. Let me start by giving you the gist of our argument. We have already gone through 2 major systemic crises in the 21st century, and the century is still young. We had the great financial crisis over a decade ago, and we're still dealing with some of its effects. And now we have the pandemic. In addition to all of that, we have this slow-rolling set of environmental crises epitomized by what we're seeing with climate change. It's clear that our governance systems are just completely overwhelmed. But why is that? It's because our conventional approaches to managing problems and managing risk are just not appropriate. They have reached their limits, and COVID is really showing us those limits. We're accustomed to governing things as though they are separable problems that can be mastered. But what we're discovering is that they're actually interlocking spheres. And they have underlying similarities in that these are complex systems, and they can be quite fragile. We argue that all these spheres and the broad system can, in fact, be made more resilient, more robust, and more adaptable.
It is helpful to think in terms of 3 interacting spheres. These spheres are fundamental to human well-being, and in all 3, we are seeing systemic fragilities. The first sphere is the political realm, how we organize ourselves to manage our common or shared problems. This includes the global order, where we are seeing rising tensions both within and between countries. The second sphere is the economic and financial system. While we have seen a reduction in global poverty, income and wealth inequality has soared within countries. And for many people, income increases have been precarious at best. The third sphere is the natural environment, in which human systems are inherently intertwined and which we seem to be destroying rapidly. Floods, rising sea levels, dead zones in oceans, massive heat waves and fires, ecosystem collapse, species extinction, with consequences we do not fully understand. So let us look briefly at how these spheres interact, as Anne just mentioned. First, let's take the economic sphere and the natural environment. Now, an economy that is characterized by rising inequality and a natural environment marked by climate volatility and collapsing ecosystems is likely to make it difficult for the average household to fend for itself, leading to divisive politics and less societal resilience. Second, let's think in terms of the economic and political sphere. Corporate and financial sectors that focus solely on profits while shirking responsibility for the environment and society, and if we couple that with weak governance, that is weak political and regulatory oversight, that is likely to worsen both the climate emergency and income inequality, which in turn will damage the private sectors and the political system. Third, let's think in terms of the environment and political spheres. A climate crisis coupled with dysfunctional governance will lead to an economy that is bad for households and the private sector, as extreme weather, fires, rising oceans disrupt supply chains and drive workers to unwanted migration. Let's take the example of the COVID-19 crisis. It is a health crisis, acutely disrupting the labor market and society by limiting our ability to collaborate and function normally. To fight the virus, governments are selectively putting their economies in comas. To accomplish this, households, firms, and subnational governments have to be supported by central or federal governments. Our economic, financial, legal, political, and social systems are simultaneously under stress. Climate volatility is making it harder to deal with the virus. And in turn, the pandemic is making it harder to respond to climate events like the fires in California. All this adds up to a truly complex world.
Indeed, it does add up to a complex world, but what does that actually mean? It's important to understand that complex is not the same as complicated. And to understand the distinction, we can use some metaphors. A complicated system is like a machine, like this broken down train. You can understand how the whole operates from understanding each of the individual pieces and how they fit together. You can tinker it into some kind of optimal performance. It's pretty straightforward to understand how you can repair it. A complex system is very different, more like this old-growth forest. It has many, many different kinds of parts, and they interact in all sorts of subtle ways that go beyond our understanding. Those interactions lead to results that aren't predictable, no matter how much you know about each of the parts. And to understand what happens when you try to manage a complex system as though it's merely complicated, let's consider the experience of the German forest managers a century or two ago. This was at a time when timber was a major crop, a major source of economic power. And so the German forest managers were heavily incentivized to maximize the production of timber. And they did. And they did it by getting rid of everything that wasn't the kind of tree that they wanted to grow. And for a while, this was highly productive. They were the marvel of the world. But it turned out that what they were doing was systematically stripping the underlying resilience out of the forest system. And after some decades of real productivity, they had sudden and precipitous collapse because they were managing a complex system as though it were merely complicated. That kind of sudden decline is the kind of systemic hazard that we're talking about. And dealing with it requires significant change in how we think and how we make decisions. Our current political structures are very good at dealing with problems that are normally distributed, where you can generally have a sense of what the risks are, where problems can be divided into different silos and managed by experts. That's not the world we're living in anymore. What we're living in now is a world of systemic change that is inherently unpredictable. Our past experience is not a good guide to what we need to do in the future. We train people to focus in very narrow silos, but our decision-making has to cross those silos. We're learning that resilience is at least as important as optimizing for efficiency, a lesson we have long disregarded. We have to look at the multi-layered interactions across many different kinds of actors, and we have to look out for feedback loops, past dependencies, time lags between cause and effect, and multiple tipping points. All of this means that we really need new principles for our governance and our decision-making.
So let's have a look at the 5 principles that we suggest to achieve resilience. And as Anne mentioned, by resilience, we mean robust and adaptable. So the first principle is robustness. Robust choices are not narrowly optimized, but work in a wide range of future scenarios. Choices that are flexible enough to take advantage of opportunities as they arise and do not unduly constrain future options for interventions which may be needed. Second, multi-layered governance. Complex societies both need integrated and broad perspectives to make good judgments. Whole of government approaches and whole of society solutions. Collaboration between the public, policymakers, experts, and other stakeholders regarding knowledge, experience, interpretation, concerns, and perspectives is critical. Third, the empowerment of self-organization. This addresses the heterogeneity of people, concerns, capacities, and effects. Systemic fragility can manifest in different ways in different places. Policymakers can do much to inform, empower, and coordinate such bottom-up responses, which are beyond the capacity of central governments alone. Fourth, communications. This is hard. This is very difficult, but crucial. It is hard to agree on a set of policies and structural changes without shared understanding of the nature of complex problems we face. Public comprehension generates trust and ownership of decisions. The fifth principle is fundamental to what we are saying here today: horizon scanning and early action. Preemptive reduction of systemic vulnerabilities and risks is key. Horizon scanning and scenario analysis can discern signs of emerging problems that could cause systemic disruption. The recent global financial crisis and the pandemic have made it clear that systemic disruptions are hugely costly to society, and the costs are largely borne by the less fortunate. Societies and political systems must motivate their leaders to focus on prevention.
Now, that's a daunting agenda that Sunil has just laid out, but there is some good news to be found in models that are out there already. One partial model of these kinds of approaches, particularly the multi-layered governance and the shared goals, et cetera, is the Paris Agreement on climate change. Now, many people look at Paris as being a weak agreement because there's no enforceable action other than saying what you want to do and then reporting on what you're doing. But that's because Paris really takes a complexity bottom-up approach to managing problems rather than our more conventional approaches. And we tried the more conventional approaches for a long time in climate and utterly failed. So how does Paris work? Well, it takes advantage of underlying realities to try to achieve a widely shared goal. The shared goal is that we know we want to keep ultimate temperature change around the world to no more than 2 degrees Celsius, and we strongly prefer to keep it below 1.5 degrees Celsius. In service of that shared goal, well, it turns out that one of the underlying realities is that many of the actions that you want to take to achieve those goals are actions that you really wanted to take for other purposes as well. For example, if you care about air pollution, one of the best things you can do is switch from coal burning to various forms of clean renewable energy. So these are things that you want to do anyhow. On agriculture, if you want to restore soils, which are badly depleted around the world, one of the things you do is sequester carbon in those soils. Again, very good for achieving climate goals. So Paris calls on its member countries to come together and each issue what's called a nationally determined contribution. And under the NDC of each country, they lay out what are the things that they want to do anyhow that also have climate benefits, or what are the things that they are prepared to do just for climate. The only requirement is that they must report on what they are actually doing toward achieving those nationally determined contributions every year or two. And then every 5 years, everybody comes back together to do a global stocktake on what the science and technology are telling us we need to be doing about climate and what is now possible to do and what's become cheaper to do. So that's one underlying reality. The other is that there is a vast array, transnationally, nationally, locally, of non-state actor networks of all kinds, and some involve governments as well, who want to take climate action for reasons of their own. And Paris very much takes advantage of the networked nature of the modern world. It encourages cities, civil society, and the private sector to take part and to work with the Paris Agreement arrangements so that we all make progress on climate change. So what's the outcome of this approach? Well, we all know that the current national government in the United States is not particularly enamored of the Paris Agreement. But it turns out that because of all of the other action that is taking place within the US is still within shouting distance of achieving the goals that had been laid out by the previous administration. And globally, as this report that we have up here on global climate action has demonstrated, if you were to take all of the multinational and multi-sector initiatives around the world for action on climate change, and they all accomplished everything they say they want to do, and you added that all up, that would get us to the 2-degree goal, which is an extraordinary accomplishment. So we can see that taking this kind of complex systems thinking approach can actually work in dealing with some of our most challenging issues. So to sum all this up and start wrapping it together, if you think about the nature of the 21st century, we know that technology is changing the nature of our economies and our human interactions. We know that we're facing a set of environmental crises, as we're seeing with shifting climate patterns. We've seen that power is flowing away from our traditional governors, but it's not necessarily flowing toward any kind of well-structured institutions. We see social unrest arising along with inequality, and we have great uncertainty about what the jobs of the future might be or what the social contract should look like.
Now, this is truly a complex world that we have described. And in this world, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to predict the exact consequences of systemic fragilities. To transit to a new political economy will definitely require a lot of experimentation and success at scale. Preemption of systemic risks may require countries to create new institutions and policy frameworks, and such frameworks should include durable ways to collaborate internationally. Preemption of systemic risks may require countries to create new institutions. But the COVID-19 pandemic is a societal stress test. Its consequences should motivate us to make our complex global society more resilient. The lessons we learn from it will be critical for facing up to the looming climate and economic crises. Success will depend not only on state capacity, but also social trust and appropriate norms of behavior, and importantly, leadership.
Thank you for joining us. We invite you to take a look at the website that is shown on this slide, thunderbird.asu.edu/UNGA2020 for more presentations from Thunderbird around the world related to this agenda. I am now going to close out the session on reckoning with systemic hazards. And let us start now looking at what Roland Coopers is going to tell us about how enterprises can manage these systemic risks. Thank you very much.
Hi there. Good evening, good morning, wherever you are. Welcome to this continuation of the seminar, and thanks to Anne and Sunil for a really interesting exposition. And what I'd like to do is pick up, so my name is Roland Coopers. I'm a professor at Thunderbird and a writer and advisor on all sorts of topics, and particularly the one that I'd like to talk to you about today, which is really to try to connect three big ideas. One is resilience, the other one is complexity, complex systems, and the third is how it applies to risk management. So what do we do practically? So let's take these things in turn. And I'll base my story in, if you're intrigued or if you're interested, there's some more you can read in this book that was published a few years ago that was really the report of a 2-year effort to wrestle exactly with these issues that was led by a number of multinational corporations that were trying to figure out what resilience might mean in practice to the way they conducted their business. So if a city came to them and said, help me with my resilience, what does that mean? And so what that means, specifically the first thing, and I think this is what I'll conclude on, so let me give you a sneak preview. It's good to think about risks in two categories. We have risks that follow normal distributions, normalized distributions, and for those we have the familiar tools that I hope you use, I'm sure you use, and essentially on one axis the probability, on the other axis the impact or some variant thereof. But the critical thing is to think about systemic issues and systemic risks as separate. You should look at them through a different lens, a different tool. And that's the tool that we've developed in this project that I mentioned before, and I want to present to you briefly today. So, but first, what is resilience? And what does it have to do with complexity? So the first thing, quickly, a definition. You're all familiar with the idea resilience is the capacity for a system or for somebody to bounce back from some disturbance or some crisis. And it's exemplified here by some crazy guy who jumps off a bridge with an elastic, hoping that the elastic is resilient enough to avoid him hitting the water below. But that is not, if that was all there was to resilience, you could simply get resilience by building stronger things, bigger walls, stronger bridges, and thicker elastics. But there's a second aspect to resilience, which is absolutely critical, and that really makes it interesting, and that is the capacity to learn and adapt from the very disturbance that it's resilient to. And the best image of that is we have here is a child whose immune system learns and adapts from the exposure to a weakened virus. That's essentially a vaccine, and probably an issue we're all too familiar with these days. But it's this joint capability. One is the capacity to bounce back, and the second thing is the capacity to learn and adapt from the disturbance that builds resilience. Now, resilience is a neutral concept. It's just a property of a system. It's neither good nor bad. This is another misunderstanding sometimes, is that the more resilience, the better. No. Organized crime is resilient. Apartheid was resilient. There are all sorts of things that are resilient you want to reduce the resilience of. If you want to change something in an organization, sometimes you might have to reduce its resilience to make it open to change. Ecosystems sometimes are more resilient than we expect. So resilience is a property of a system, and you have to decide separately whether you want more of it or less of it, and depending on the context and the issue. The other thing to mention is that resilience is not best friends with efficiency. Here we have a picture of two animals. On the left, a tardigrade, which is by far the most resilient animal on the planet. You can boil it, put him in vacuum, do whatever, and it'll it'll survive and adapt. And on the right, we have these beautiful wild cats that actually are remarkably unresilient. Here's one who's in captivity in Bolivia and taken out for a walk by expats every day because they can't adapt and be released back into the jungle because they have so little adaptive capacity. Notice that we have an aesthetical predilection for efficiency over resilience, and that's sometimes an issue. But this is a universal law. You cannot have both efficiency and resilience as a matter of principle. So finally, resilience only exists as a property of complex systems. Now, many of you may be familiar with what complex systems are. There isn't time enough to go into that in detail. But it's important to know a system, an engineered system, a linear system doesn't have resilience properties because it doesn't have this adaptive capacity. And here are two of the giants in the field. One is Elinor Ostrom, who's written very eloquently about social resilience and social adaptation and what it takes to make a complex social system resilient. And on the right is the author of Panarchy, which is a really interesting book about the resilience of ecological systems, so the societal and the ecological side. But this idea that it is a property of an underlying system and that only complex systems actually are able to be resilient is quite essential. Now, how do we deal with resilience? So how can we, in a real, when you have a system, an organization, or some problem, and I realize these are many things, how do we assess, or how can we understand what interventions might make it more resilient? Well, in order to do that, we've developed this tool, which has been widely published, but I just want to give you a quick preview, overview of it. And it constitutes of 3 buckets of 3 lenses each. And there are ways of looking at a system that allow you to see what interventions might make it more resilient. So going to the first bucket, which we call structural resilience, those are the measures that you can take to make tweak the structure so that it becomes more resilient. The first one, very familiar, is redundancy. And redundancy is familiar because the spare tire of a car, it's keeping reserve capacity, it's extra staff, it's basically building resilience through spare capacity. Now that works and that's great, but it's also the most expensive strategy to build resilience. A second one is modularity. If you cut a system into different modules that interact with each other and are loosely connected, I think intuitively it's clear that that would be more resilient, possibly less efficient, remember. And the third element here is diversity. Now diversity is obviously a good thing in general and for all sorts of equity and societal reasons. But there's a different reason. It also helps to build resilience. But there the real question should be requisite diversity. So what type of diversity and how much of it do you need in order to build the resilience that you're after? So this is quite a functional way of looking at diversity. And again, it doesn't negate the entire other field of diversity. But if you're looking at resilience, the question is, what is the requisite diversity for a particular system? Moving on to the second bucket, which we call integrative resilience. And those are, again, 3 elements. One is multiscalarity. Now, that's a bit of a tricky concept, but it's actually also very familiar. If you think about a city, it has individuals and families and communities, neighborhoods, the city itself and regions around the city. There are all these layers to systems. And it's a deep property of systems that makes them resilient. If you have those layers and they're well interconnected, the system is more resilient. And contrast that, for example, with a hierarchical system where everybody takes their orders from the top. That may seem efficient, and it is sometimes efficient, but it's certainly not resilient. The second idea is thresholds. Now, clearly in the past, we see there are discontinuities all the time. The pandemic is a blatant example, but there are more subtle ones. But it is a really good example. And you see how difficult it is for people to, when they think about the future and they think about risks and things that they need to deal with, how difficult it is to think about these discontinuities that cannot be forecast, and yet they happen. So the capacity to think about discontinuities in the future is an essential way of building resilience. The third element here is social cohesion. Is I think that again is quite intuitive. Is being well embedded in a community and society and taking in views and opinions through deep engagement, so real engagement, not just trying to sell your ideas, but actually give and take, and listening to people is a way of being more resilient. Okay, the third bucket is, again, 3 ideas, and this is transformational resilience. This is important because systems do not become resilient by not changing. Sometimes bouncing back to the original point is not possible, and systems need to evolve. And so these are kind of the 3 elements that allow a system to evolve. The first one is distributed or polycentric governance, which is an idea that was very well articulated by Elinor Ostrom, who I mentioned before. And the idea is that if you have somewhat messy, distributed, a little bit overlapping governance, as we have, for example, in liberal democracies, that builds more resilience than top-down centralized hierarchical control, which sometimes can be more efficient, absolutely, although not always. But understanding more deeply that this type of distributed governance is actually a good and desirable thing, and this slight messiness that it has, which can annoy us, but is an important property. Obviously, things can be a real mess as well, but a proper distributed governance really builds resilience. The second thing is the capacity to have a foresight practice. It's foresight, scenario planning. This goes by multiple names, but the ability to think about the future and multiple futures and the uncertainties about the future, and have a language in your community or your organization to be able to discuss this. The third element and last one is innovation and experimentation. And this, I don't mean just innovation for the sake of coming up with something new, as important as that is, but innovation actually means that you continue to explore the edges of systems, you continue to look for unfamiliar areas, and that activity, that capacity to do that and look there in itself builds resilience. And when something surprising or unexpected happens, an organization or a community is better able to deal with it. Now, don't think of these 9 elements as a linear checkbox system of, if you've got these 9 things, then you're resilient. Think of it as portrayed in this image as a crystal, as a set of lenses to look at the thing, again, system, community, whatever you're concerned with, that of which you want to enhance or sometimes even decrease the resilience. But looking at it in turn through these 9 different lenses will help you identify a set of interventions, of measures that builds resilience. And finally, looping back to the original chart, the way to do this is to look separately at the standard, if I dare call them, but certainly risks that follow a normalized distribution with a familiar tool set. And then look independently, and it could be as practical as, cutting the meeting at which you discuss these things in 2, spending 1/2 hour on the first set and 1/2 hour on the second set with the proper preparing staff work. But then look at the risks, the issues that you have through these 9 different lenses, and that allows you to identify which interventions or which measures are appropriate for this particular situation. So it's a lot to cram in 15 minutes, but I wanted to give you a sense of how, only complex systems have resilience properties, and how resilience when seen as the system of, as this kind of a property with this tool, which is a really practical tool that I've described to you rapidly, is a way of identifying and interventions and actions that build the kind of resilience that you need for in a particular context. Thank you very much for your attention, and we'll move on to the panel.
Thank you so much, Roland. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm now our panel to join as well. If you can click on your share audio and video to come in and join us. I'm going to introduce them very briefly before I start asking them some questions and we get a conversation going. But I need to start before I introduce them by emphasizing that they are not here in their mute something. They are here as students in Thunderbird's Executive Master of Arts in Global Affairs and Management, which I mentioned at the beginning, is a program that in part introduces these concepts and helps people develop the skills and the tools and the frameworks that are needed to apply them to real world problems, which of course is exactly what most of us are now grappling with in this world of unending shocks. So let me start by very briefly introducing them. Mamadou Diallo is economic counselor at the Embassy of Guinea in Washington, D.C. And Clarissa Dietrich is with the Arizona State Department of Economic Security. Maggie Mwanza is with the Embassy of Malawi in Washington, D.C. So as you can see, we have quite a variety of people joining us for this panel. I'm going to start off by asking some quick questions about how they are actually applying these tools and thinking about the applications of these principles and tools in their work. And we'll also be trying to keep an eye on the chat. So please continue to put in your questions and comments. We've already got quite a good conversation going. Mamadou, let's start with you. You have been involved in your government's work on pandemics, first with Ebola and now with COVID-19. And in between, through the EMAGM, you have been exposed to these complexity concepts. And from my conversations with you, my understanding is that this has changed the way you think about how your government should act. And in fact, has changed to some degree how your government has acted in response to this pandemic. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Thank you, Professor Anne, for these opportunities. In 2014 and 2014, my country, Guinea, was hit by Ebola. At this time, I was Assistant Minister of Mine. My job was to provide practical solutions to the mining company, how they can operate without to stop their activity because of Ebola. I was a macroeconomist, a linear approach, top down. But after Ebola, I was looking for a training to understand how I can apply a policy in the context of complex and interconnected world. That is why I registered to the EMAGM, Executive Master of Global Master and Affairs. When COVID-19 my country, I was approached by our national agency to help them to apply what I learned with Thunderbird. That was a good case. And the first thing is to see the COVID-19 not a health issue. It's an economic issue, financial and societal issue. What we did, we did a survey from local communities, mining companies, private companies, decision makers, doctors, nurses, to ask them what is your understanding of COVID-19? How can you handle it? We collect those data and we put in place a model that can help today the government in terms of communication, because communication is a key issue when we have to deal with a complex issue. And today this model help with stakeholders to share information, to anticipate, because today if you look in West Africa, we have one of the lowest death rate in sub-region, thanks to this model. We have another views to deal of complex issues, not only a linear approach to have something like a bottom up, to ask local communities, because there's something to say. You have to ask them if you have those information from nurseries that care of the sick people. And if you have all those data, you can put them together and to put something. That is my understanding. And my belief is that in the increasing inequality, the government can use the kind of tools to implement the UN Sustainable Development Goal, because we will see in the coming years with a complex issue. That is what is my learning, my takeaway from 2014 and 2020. It's a big change in my views to analyze economic policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Mamadou. I'm really struck by hearing how you've very directly applied in a way that really made a difference for your country this kind of thinking and these kind of tools, the focus on the diversity of relevant actors, on how things connect across different silos, the need for a different kind of communication and a different kind of action. And it appears to have been highly successful. It has saved lives. And I think that's an important point. These are not just broad theoretical frameworks. As I said at the beginning, we really do need to be thinking and governing differently if we are going to be dealing with the complexity of the world that we are now facing. Clarissa, I'd like to turn to you next for a very different level. You're in the state government of the state of Arizona here in the United States, and your focus is on dealing with economic security for the state of Arizona, which clearly has been under some stress of late, as has the economic security of the entire world. But you've also got some great initiatives going there with some really underserved populations. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. So I work for the Department of Economic Security, and we have been working to pivot and work with previously overlooked grassroots and community level organizations to really look for that information as to what barriers and communities and individuals face. In this dialogue, we found continues to assist us policymakers and public administrators in implementing programs to address the needs of people to move towards goals such as self-sufficiency and opportunities to get out of the continuous cycle of poverty. So for example, in my department's division of Employment and Rehabilitation Services, a partnership was initiated to create a program called the Second Chance Centers. And this is a partnership established with the Governor's Office, the Department of Corrections, Rehabilitation and Reentry, and the Department of Economic Security. So 3 state agencies, which can sometimes be tricky. So this is a reentry program for offenders aimed at reducing recidivism by providing individuals with skills, tools, and opportunities to prepare to enter the workforce prior to their release from prison. So throughout this process, the program provides workforce mentorship and guidance as a model for the effective communication and professional behavior. More recently, we've continued to add these initiatives over just the past 3 years that this program has been running. And these have included connecting individuals with nutrition assistance programs, applying for medical benefits, connecting them with vital records in the DMV to obtain birth certificates, driver's license, ID cards, which most employers require prior to hire. We found that these things were all significant barriers post-release that we needed to address to help them, get back to employment and get on their feet in a stable environment. So these partnerships have been built with the Arizona Department of Housing, the Home Builders Association of Central Arizona, faith-based and community organizations. And we found that through these partnerships with the public sector, different trade representatives from the private sector and civil societies, we've really provided a resource and able to leverage long-term successful outcomes. So with all of that being said, ultimately, this program is aimed at influencing the behaviors of the agents in order to change the emergent properties that we've seen, such as continuous cycles of poverty and crime. So by providing these support, tools, skills, and other needs to these individuals, we've been able to reduce their chances of reoffending and ending back in prison. So this goes further than just giving someone a job, which would be like a market approach, or requiring businesses to hire these people, kind of a control and command approach. And this program offers a continuum of services such as evidence-based intensive substance abuse counseling, self-control, anger management, parenting skills, money management, and other self-improvement classes. So really trying to approach this with a holistic view to try to, like I said, mitigate all of those barriers. So doing so, we've been able to, like I said, prevent recidivism, and we've actually received a prestigious award through the National Association of State Workforce Agencies in 2019, and that was for our innovation in the area of workforce development, and this is something we're very proud of. And we found that through including all of the different community partners, you know, from the people that are right there in the communities all the way up, that we've been able to achieve great initiatives and set Arizona apart from other states in achieving new goals for our citizens.
And really dramatic of how much difference it can make if you start applying these to problem solving rather than sticking with approaches that we know haven't worked all that well in the past, and certainly are becoming even more challenging now in the conditions of the 21st century. I'm going to turn to Maggie in just a moment. And Roland, I also want to put you on notice that I'm going to be bringing you into the conversation, both to comment on everything that the students have been putting forward, but also to talk a little more broadly about your own work in terms of how these kinds of principles apply to dealing with climate change, or how do these principles apply when you're talking about the roles of the private sector, given your extensive corporate experience. But first, let me bring in Maggie. And you and I have had some conversations thinking broadly about global governance and international relations, which is our background for both of us. And you've got some very interesting ideas on trade and how thinking about global trade and trade systems and the international politics of trade connect to these kinds of ideas. So what do you have in mind?
Well, thank you very much for having me on this forum. And to start with, I think that, you know, as I was reflecting on this topic, you know, one thing that I thought about was the current pandemic that we're experiencing and the immense spillover effects in what began as a health crisis and has quickly accelerated to a socio-economic and trade crisis. You know, so this actually calls for new ways of thinking and doing things differently. You know, and fortunately enough, you know, as from the start of this session, we have tools that we can use to help us to plan better, not just in this in this pandemic, but also in my work as well. And one of the tools that I found like really, really helpful was the scenario planning that actually helps us to look at, as we're planning for the future, to plan for different scenarios and not just focus on this linear and conventional kind of thinking where we just, you know, we're looking at the cause and effect kind of relationship. But the scenario planning actually helps us to prepare better in this world of, you know, unpredictability. And then as well as, you know, in addition to that, I think that as we're experiencing more challenges in this complex and, you know, unpredictable world, we need to have greater coordination efforts, not only between state and non-state actors as we have been doing, but also we need to think of horizontal coordination. And by that, what I mean is that we need to have, you know, our specialized multilateral institutions, such as the WTO and the WHO, work together. Because as I have said, we have spillover effects from the health sector that are moving on to the trade sector. So as much as these are specialized agencies, we really need to coordinate at the horizontal level and not just on a vertical level. And then I think, as well as in one of the discussions that we had when I was thinking and reflecting about, you know, how can we apply these concepts in a changing world, was the need to rethink how and what we measure. So, for example, you know, while the GDP has been an important key indicator of economic progress and well-being, we need to consider building on these metrics that we have been using for a long time so that they reflect the complexities of our time. And, you know, one of the tools as well that we can use in as we're moving forward and facing these global challenges and different ways of thinking is to go beyond just the metrics. And one of the concepts that, you know, we can use and that is more holistic, you know, for measuring human progress, and that takes into account issues that matter to us, in our social and ecological spheres includes the donut economics framework, which views the world as an ever-evolving complex system that cannot be understood with single approaches. So these are very effective tools that can help us move forward as we're grappling with these unpredictabilities and try to build a more resilient world. Thank you.
Much, Maggie. And before I turn it to Roland, I just have to say a word about donut economics. So for those of you who are not familiar with the concept, it literally is donut, the food, economics. This is a concept developed by Rayworth several years ago to take something that I think is very familiar to most people, or increasingly so, which is the idea that there are outer limits, planetary limits, that we need to live within if we're going to have a stable world that can actually support us, a natural environment. And that within those planetary boundaries, we also need to have a social floor. The SDGs or something similar to that, that is a minimum level below which we don't allow people to fall. And so in a week or so, Donut Economics is launching an action lab. So for anyone who is interested in learning more about the concept of Donut Economics and how it applies, I strongly suggest you Google that and get involved, because it's one of the tools that helps pull all of this, what can seem to be overwhelming complexity, together and give you a framework that allows you to act. With that, let me turn it over to Roland. You've been hearing everything that our students have been describing, and of course you've been working in this area for quite a long time, both as a writer and in the private sector. So your comments.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you for those contributions. They're wonderful stories to hear, and I have great admiration for this, because none of this is easy, right? So Maggie, also thank you for highlighting the issue with metrics, right? There's a lot of misunderstanding around metrics, that they are somehow the thing that truly represent a system. But we know that in complex systems, they can only be rough proxies, just as, try to catch your personal life in metrics and you realize how little that means. Some things are important, but they often get represented as the true goal of things. So it was wonderful to hear. Just a few remarks on climate, since you asked, and then we'll return back to these great examples. One of the curious things about climate change is that an enormous amount of energy is spent on what we should do. And actually, that's probably the easiest part of the whole story. If people still don't know what we should do about climate change, they really haven't been paying attention, because it's a fairly short list of things. Get out of coal, stop eating red meat, and there's a number of things like that. But the much harder question, and I think it was also represented in these stories, is actually not the what, but it's the how. What is it? Can we understand the system that we're trying to influence well enough? And we know with these complex systems, we'll never understand them perfectly, and they'll always surprise us. But can we get enough of a sense that we can develop a theory of change that's effective? And that's the much harder work than figuring out the what. I mean, a pandemic's pretty easy. You need to get rid of the virus, so fine, that's the what. But figuring out, as Mamadou described, is which are the actors that are the critical interconnections that you need to talk to, that you need to mobilize. How does the thing work? And for climate change, I think that's also true. We've tended, I would say, almost to fantasize about, somebody should do this and that. There will be some top-down intervention that will fix things. And we should have learned now, after 50 years of trying or not trying, is that is unlikely to happen, because we can't. The system is so stuck that we need to think more deeply about how it works and how you can mobilize forces from the bottom up at scale, because this obviously needs to go at scale. Anyways, it's a plea for thinking harder about how, and spending more time just talking to people about how things work and what are the critical interconnections. And that's often the hardest thing. And this is, I think, what I would ask the three people who described these wonderful stories. one of the challenges with complexity is, in a sense, everything's connected to everything, but that really means you don't know what to do, right? So the first challenge is always, making a wise choice of, these are the 5 interconnections that I think really matter, and I'm going to start working on those. So how do you choose those? And how did you find any, did you adapt along the way by saying, I chose 5 and I figured out actually only 4 are right and I found another one along the way? Can you maybe say something about that selection process of the interconnections that really drive the behavior of the system, finding those and also making mistakes along the way?
So who would like to talk about that? Yeah, Clarissa, please.
So for my example specifically, what our department focused on, it's based off of offenders, so individuals with a criminal background. So kind of digging into why crime happens, what perpetuates it, why do people reoffend and end up back in prison. And a lot of those things I mentioned were just having a lot of basic needs met, the continuous cycle of poverty, lack of opportunities for employment, housing, transportation, those without homes. We found that they had a really hard time getting back into society, into the workforce, because they just didn't have a stable environment. And, without those basic necessities of having just a mailing address that you have to have for job applications, those are just all things that we tried to address. So I think for us, it was just trying to determine the most impactful thing to start with and then working our way down. But we also knew that we would have to collaborate with the different sectors, and that's how we've done with the job fairs that come to the different centers to just, start connecting people with different jobs that they could be interested in, and just really try to, garner that motivation and independence that we found that so many of those people kind of lacked, and just really needed that support, from the community and somebody, a lot of times their mentor who cared. So I guess I'll leave it at that.
Thanks. Mamadou?
And Clarissa, did you ask, because I think I'm curious Mamadou's reaction, because what struck from his story is also just going out and asking people, right? Is, what do you think? And you did that as well, Clarissa, to get these, was that part of it?
So the department did, working with different agencies, because within the Division of Employment Rehabilitative Services, we also work with shelters that house individuals experiencing homelessness. So those were, kind of where we started connecting, and just also people that did end up back in prison, asking them kind of what happened, and then just trying to kind of connect all those dots. So it's definitely taken us a few years to get there. The initiative started in 2017. So 2019 is really when things were picking back up. But again, just trying to, start that conversation and figure out the key things to address.
So Mamadou, I'm going to bring you in a second, but Roland just wanted to let you know that someone is asking, where can they find your 9 lenses? So if you could just put a link in the chat, if there's some place that they can go look them up. All right, Mamadou?
Yeah, for my case, we were facing many challenges, and what we did what we call the leverage point. If you have people have less $1 by day and try to lock down the economy, and that will be very difficult. So our advice to the government was to put in place a financial transfer to the poor people, what they did, because today we have mobile bank, and the government put in place this fund to help people to stay home. You can't say people to stay home without something. And that was our problem. The first point was find what is the leverage point. The leverage point was the financial transfer to the local communities, what the government did, and I think that was a good starting point. You are right. It's very difficult to find what is the right way to start. That is why it is very important to make this survey, to ask the stakeholders what they are thinking in terms of management of the system. I think that's what we did, and I have to deal with maybe the common month or common year. I think another issue I will do this.
We only have a minute or so left, so I'm going to ask Maggie for any last comments and then give the penultimate. Maggie?
Thank you. I'll be very quick. I know we don't have much time. I mean, I work in government, and in terms of priorities, and that's one thing that also needs to change, because, you know, government has this traditional way of doing things. We have our priorities, but I think what would be helpful in a complex world is to have these constant feed loops, you know, where we constantly go back and forth and then see what's changing. Our priorities is still in the same order, or have they changed? I think that's also, you know, once we go back to the feed loops and then see what is it that needs to change at this point in time, and then we go back and forth. I think that would also really be helpful. So I'll stop. I know we don't have much time.
Thanks. Roland, you've got about 30 seconds.
Yeah, I would invite anybody who's interested is, you know, this complexity stuff, it really has intellectual running room, and take some time to learn about it. There are good books, and it's well beyond, you know, some consulting framework that you can pick up through a couple of A4s. So you know, there's wonderful stuff and videos and books and papers out there. So it's really worth taking time. There's a lot to learn. There are models. There's a little bit of math and lots of interesting stuff. So roll up your sleeves, I would say.
Great words to end on. Thank you all so much for joining us, panelists, Roland, and everyone who has stuck with us through the hour, which is quite a lot of people. We're delighted to see. And we look forward to continuing the conversation on complexity. Thank you so much.